Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest Full Steam Ahead webcast. I'm Brian Schmidt, librarian at Geothermal Rising, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. Before I introduce our speaker, I do have a few announcements to make. I want to let you all know that we're recording this event, and it'll be on our YouTube channel as of next week. Also, we will be having a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to enter your questions at any time using the Q&A function in the Zoom UI. And we want to thank our members for their continued support. Your membership helps us continue our mission to build and strengthen the geothermal industry, and we appreciate it. So looking at we want to thank our Earth Energy visionaries, Turboden, Siemens, Kenai, Exceed, Ever, Quays, SLB, Calpine, Baker Hughes, Egg Geo. We also want to thank our geothermal champions. Sorry, having a little problem with the slides here. Burns McDonald, COSO Operating Company, BHE, Chevron, Fervo, Expro, Bantam, Halliburton, Ormat, NOV, Carbo, Exergy, Oxy, Sinclair, and Southern Company. We also want to thank our clean energy sustainers, Zanskar, Steamflow, XGS, Valoric, National Lab of the Rockies, Geologica, Imperial County, DTEC, Distributed Energy Group, Neighbors, Respect, Central Washington University, Baseload Capital, and Amoresco. We have some upcoming events I want to make sure you're aware of. We've got our Thermal Energy Network Symposium in March, the Geothermal Investment Forum in April, at the same time, the Technical Symposium on Mutual Challenges and Solutions, also in April. Then at the end of April, the Capitol Hill Day in Washington. We have the Indigenous Geothermal Symposium coming up in June in Calgary, and the Geothermal Rising Conference in September in Houston, Texas. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Ann Garth is the Senior Geothermal Associate for the Super Hot Rock Geothermal Program at Clean Air Task Force. She develops and advocates for policies to promote next generation geothermal, including super hot rock geothermal, working towards efficient, safe, and widespread adoption of this transformational energy source. Her work includes initiatives at both the federal and state levels, and she also leads Clean Air Task Force's research into the social science of geothermal energy, which we're going to be talking about a bit today. So without any further ado, take it away, Ann.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Brian, can you let me know if my slides are visible?
Yep, I can see them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will apologize for the scratchy voice. I am fighting off a cold, so I may have to pause and cough at various points, but still so excited to be here and talk with all of you about the findings from CATF's research. Before I get into the findings, I want to take a moment to recognize the unique situation in which we find ourselves as a geothermal community. For a long time, geothermal has flown under the radar. People were not familiar, people were not up to date or understanding geothermal. And we're all used to that. That's the world we've lived in for a while. And that world is very rapidly changing. We are seeing an absolute explosion of coverage of geothermal. And it's not just a change in the number of articles and kind of the volume, but also in who is talking about geothermal. We have major outlets covering geothermal for basically the first time ever in a kind of sustained way. So we're really in the midst of a sea change in the geothermal landscape. And what we have seen with other energy sources is that as public awareness increases, public perceptions can change quickly. There is not a single well-known energy source in the United States that doesn't have an organized opposition movement. And we are already seeing that initial stirring of opposition happening for geothermal as well. For instance, I'll talk later in the presentation about a letter from some environmental groups in California expressing concern about geothermal. So basically, I think, opposition comes for everyone and it's coming for geothermal too. And so the question then is, what should the geothermal community do to build public support and try to prevent some of this strong opposition that we have seen for other energy sources? Before I get into the research, I'll just briefly mention CATF, some background. We are a nonprofit. We work in the US and around the world on numerous different technologies and energy sources, including geothermal. You can see our mission statement here on the slide. Brian gave a great intro of my background. I work on the geothermal team, doing policy work and social science research. And this research project has been something I've enjoyed so much in the last year. Basically, the question that we had for this research project was, how do we communicate with the public in a way that builds support for next generation geothermal while, of course, maintaining accuracy and honesty? And I'm not going to drag you through every single detail on this slide, but just to communicate that we did have a lot of methodological rigor in how we approached that question. We partnered with a leading research firm, and they helped us with focus groups, 2 different surveys. We had a representative sample of US voters, really trying to bring a data-driven lens to answering this question. And our research focused on next generation geothermal. As you can see from this little description that we gave our survey respondents, we were tech agnostic. We were not focused on any particular subset of next gen, but just, gave people kind of broad information about how it works. So with that, let's talk about the findings, and I'll start with the good news. People like geothermal. We gave people that little paragraph that you just saw describing geothermal, and then we asked them, do you support or oppose using next generation geothermal to generate electricity? And we had over 60% in support. And that finding was also consistent across demographics, like your political party, your gender, where in the country you live. So we had, clear level of support. That's great. However, asking people if they support geothermal in the abstract is different from supporting a project near you. So we dug in a little deeper on this question by asking, if your state was thinking about investing in a project, would you support or oppose it? And what we found is that while geothermal performs well, other technologies perform better. And when we had another question on this, asking the people who are listed here in blue, saying that they support geothermal, forcing them to pick which energy source they would be most supportive of or most excited about, only 10% of them picked geothermal. So while it is really exciting to see those positive poll results that show a high level of support, I think, if you'll pardon the pun, that support is shallow. And ultimately what we need for sustained deployment of geothermal is deeper, consistent, stronger, and more stable support. And so there is more work to do on that. And I think the way to accomplish that is by giving people more information, right? Understandably, people who don't know very much about geothermal are uncertain. They're not going to want to jump into fully supporting a new technology that they've really never heard of or don't know very much about. And there's lots of research on this. I highlighted a couple quotes here. I'm not going to read all of them, but this also came up in our focus groups as well. People really want to know more. They have concerns, they have questions, they want answers. And I think the key takeaway is that we're in a great starting place, and we can help give people that information in a way that answers their questions. So that's what the rest of this presentation is about. What information should we share? How do we present that information? How do we do this communication? And the sort of obvious place to start is concerns, right? What does worry people about geothermal? I think it won't surprise most of the people watching this to know that the biggest concerns for voters are groundwater contamination, followed by seismicity or earthquakes. We asked people at the start of our survey to rate these concerns, and then at the end of the survey, we asked them again to pick their top 2 concerns. And the concerns were very consistent from the start to the end of the survey. They were very consistent by demographics like partisanship, region of the country. So really clear feedback here across our sample that these concerns are rising to the top. And for all of these concerns, then the question is, okay, how do I respond, right? Someone has this worry. What answer can we give those people that is reassuring to them? And so that was what we wanted to look at next, not just what concerns people have, but how we can share data in a way that is useful. And we wanted to develop not just one-off responses to a particular concern, but a larger theoretical framework to help understand what types of information make people feel reassured. So we used seismicity as our case study. We did a separate survey actually on this, and we had all of these different responses to seismicity concerns, and we kind of grouped them by category, right? We had some concerns about technical risk, which is really about details of what happens in the subsurface and the actions developers take. We had some responses that were about putting geothermal in a larger context related to either past development or to other things in people's lives. We had this outside monitoring option. We had an option about the developers' incentives. And then we had this other one that I kind of threw in there at the last minute. And people got different subsets of these in different options, and they were asked to pick which option makes you feel most reassured about safety and which makes you feel least reassured. And across many people responding and ranking different subsets of all of these answers, we're able to mathematically calculate across the full sample which of these responses is the most reassuring. And what we found is that the technical risk reduction messages, particularly these top two, really stood out. You can see on the right-hand column, the preference share, which is basically how reassuring, like how many of our respondents, what percentage of them found each message to be the number one most reassuring message. And the distinctions are very clear. The survey firm that actually fielded this survey out in the field, when they were showing me the data, when we first got the results back, they said, quote, "What we're seeing here is something data scientists dream of." So that's very clear feedback. And the findings were consistent, again, by demographics, by gender, by age, by political party. So we can be highly confident that the messages at the top here really do work. And that doesn't mean that the messages that performed worse are actively counterproductive. It just means that they are less reassuring than the messages that performed better by a pretty dramatic margin. And we also saw this in our open response answers as well. So the very first message that performed the best in the quantitative data was this one about tracking activity underground in real time with an automatic shutoff if shaking goes above safe levels. And that particular phrase, automatic shutoff, came up a lot in the open-ended response sections at the end when we asked people, what from the survey do you remember that made you feel more comfortable about geothermal? A lot of people brought up this automatic shutoff. So you may be thinking, okay, great, case closed. We'll just talk about technical risk reduction. But I think as I dug into the data more, it became a little bit more complicated because we also had this A/B test that we did on water contamination. So basically, two paragraphs, almost identical, differences in that light blue font in the middle. And half of the people got one version and half got the other. The regulation version was focusing on that kind of outside monitoring or regulation angle. The technical version was focusing more on, details about what happens in the subsurface, details about the rock. And what we found is that the regulation message actually did slightly better overall, which kind of seems like it would contradict our earlier results. And what I found really interesting was if you look back at the technical message here, the one that performed less well, it's a technical message that doesn't mention safety protocols at all. It just talks about the rock. Whereas the technical message that performed here, I mean, first of all, the technical message and the outside monitoring have a clean sweep of the top five. So those two categories really performed the best. And the technical message that performed the best out of all of them, this item number one at the very top, mentions an automatic shutoff if shaking goes above safe levels, which I think is really implying some level of outside monitoring, right? Some external automatic process. And so I think it really points to a synthesis of these two messages where if we bring together technical risk reduction and outside monitoring to share a message about safety protocols that are informed by technical data. Ultimately, people want to know that projects are safe when they have a safety concern. That's what they want to know. And the thing that makes them feel that projects are safe is having data-informed safety precautions. We see this in other research as well. I've just quoted two articles here about seismicity and perceptions of seismicity, which are highlighting very similar findings, right? Whether seismic risk can be controlled, policy, regulation, prediction, monitoring, really bringing together this technical informed understanding and some sort of external, monitoring and regulation. And I think there's this great study, Liu et al. Out of the Netherlands, that I think puts it into the right frame, which basically this study talks about two key types of trust. Integrity-based trust, which is, the person in charge of the project cares about safety, and competence-based trust, which is the person in charge of the project is knowledgeable and skilled enough that they can actually do the project safely. And I think the data that we've just looked at is a really good example of building competence-based trust, highlighting the message of we have safeguards in place to minimize risk that are informed by scientific and technical knowledge. And it's important to note while we tested this on water contamination and seismicity, I hypothesized that it would apply more broadly as a general approach to communicating about safety concerns. Now, it's important to recognize that the messages that performed best, like the message about tracking activity underground in real time with an automatic shutoff, is basically testing the induced seismicity mitigation protocol. We didn't use that acronym, but that is the content of what was in that message. And that protocol is not required for every project. So in order for us to be able to say with a straight face the messaging that is most reassuring to voters in the US, there may be a need for regulatory changes to actually ensure that those safety protocols do exist. So with that, I want to continue on to this theme of how you say what you want to say and talk a little bit about analogies. This is something that really startled me in the focus groups that we hosted. People kept bringing up analogies for geothermal. I've listed some on this slide. A lot of them were not that accurate. A lot of them were kind of misunderstandings, right, of how geothermal works. And as I thought about it, it was like, well, of course, it's common sense. People who don't know very much about geothermal, they're trying to understand it. An analogy or a metaphor, it's a hook, right, from something they know to help them get their mind around geothermal. And it was really startling to me, and I think it's important to recognize like how important that is to the way that people process information about new technologies. Now, it is the case that the analogies that we tested in our quantitative research here performed relatively poorly. That doesn't mean that they didn't work, but they were definitely less effective. So I'm not suggesting that we highlight analogies above the other content that performed better, but it is the case that our open-ended survey at the end did bring up some answers from people who were kind of remembering the concert and football game analogy. And we had some evidence from one of our A/B tests as well, kind of indicating that analogies are memorable if they're tangible and connected to your life. So I think as the geothermal community is talking to folks about geothermal, it can be helpful to kind of lean into that natural impulse that people have, using analogies that are accurate, that are familiar, that are relevant to people's lives, and offering those proactively so that people aren't, coming up with analogies on their own that might be inaccurate. We can offer them analogies that are helpful. And I've listed a couple examples here, and I hope if other folks have great analogies that have, really worked in their communications that you'll share with the broader geothermal community. And a specific case study of analogies that I think is really important to recognize is this case study of analogies around subsurface risk. There's some fascinating research basically indicating that when we think about the subsurface, when I think about the subsurface, or probably most of the people listening to this presentation, it's very straightforward. We think about the subsurface all the time. We work in geothermal. That's what our job is. And that's really different for a lot of members of the public. Members of the public have weird associations with the deep underground. They are thinking about things like zombies, burial, journey to the center of the earth, the core, all of these things that feel foreign, scary, uncertain, and make them feel hesitant. And we actually saw this the very first survey that CATF did on public perceptions of geothermal way back in 2023 had all of these quotes that came up in our open-ended responses around, isn't it dangerous? Who knows? Messing with the earth is never good. So there's this really different perception that the general public has about the subsurface compared to what we as the geothermal community have. And the risk is that the way that we talk about the subsurface might accidentally trigger these concerns or this uncertainty or skepticism without us even realizing it. And so I think the way to address that is to really emphasize subsurface knowledge. I did a quick little Google looking at the kind of geothermal 101 pages that a lot of developers, nonprofits, government associations have that are just explaining like what is geothermal and how does it work. And what I realized is not a single one of those pages, including CATFs, mentioned subsurface mapping in any kind of detail. So your average person just Googling about geothermal could read all these 101 pages and come away with the understanding that actually we don't really know what's going on down there. We're just like drilling a well and crossing our fingers. And obviously that is not accurate, but it is on us as the geothermal community to make sure people understand the modeling, the characterization, the monitoring that happens from the very beginning of a project all the way throughout the project. And to emphasize that more strongly so people understand, what we actually do and don't know about the subsurface. And then similarly, something I hear folks say a lot, and that I have said myself many times, is using a shorthand and saying things like, well, we don't know anything about the rock, right? That's why subsurface characterization matters. That's why first of a kind projects are expensive, because we don't know anything about the rock. Of course, it's going to be expensive. And what I realized after doing this research is that the general public may interpret that literally as we don't know anything about the rock. We don't know if there's a fault, right? We don't know what's going on down there. And actually, that's not what we mean, right? What we mean is like, we don't know the geothermal gradient. We don't know exactly how the rock hardness is going to change with depth. We don't know the things we need to know about the project, about the rock, to inform the project viability. And so my recommendation, and this is something I have changed in how I speak about geothermal, is being careful to not downplay our knowledge, being a little bit more precise with our language and saying, we're still learning about the rock, or being specific about what we do and don't know, so that we don't accidentally give people the impression, again, that we're just like drilling down there and crossing our fingers, rather so people have an understanding of the level of detailed subsurface knowledge and can kind of exit this space of uncertainty and fear and move into the space of, knowledge and understanding. So, having now discussed what to say and how to say it, the next thing I want to talk about is who should be doing the talking, right? Who is trusted? Who is a good messenger in this space? And we asked this question in the context of seismicity. I think it applies more broadly to next-gen geothermal as a whole. And we asked people, we gave them this long list of folks, and we said, who do you trust to give you information? And we calculated a net trust, which is basically the people who said they do trust and the people who said they didn't, and you subtract. So positive number means there is a lot of more trust than distrust, and vice versa for a negative number. And so as you can see, we have, scientists, engineers, people who live near geothermal energy plants really rising to the top as the most trusted voices on these topics. And other research aligns with that. There's a lot of other research on trust scores, energy project neighbors, right? People who live near existing projects, local organizations, academics, university staff, consistently rising to the top. Whereas elected officials, private companies, governments tend to be near the bottom. And we saw that really strongly in our focus groups and in our qualitative, like open-ended questions at the end of the survey. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but they give a very visceral sense of the way that people perceive some of these actors, right? Government is seen as corrupt, as biased, as not responsive to communities. Private companies are seen as profit motivated. They're just going to, lie to people or mislead the public. And this is especially true for oil and gas companies. And we see that starting to really transfer, that mistrust of oil and gas, transferring over to geothermal. We don't just see that in this survey. We also are seeing that, starting to see that in the wild. This is the example I mentioned earlier, a letter from a group of environmental organizations in California expressing concern about geothermal. They were mentioning horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And they quoted heavily from this Newsweek article. And the quotes from the Newsweek article that they quoted in their letter are up here on the screen, borrowing a page from the oil industry's playbook, using drilling technology advanced by the oil and gas industry, drilling deeper, drilling sideways, drilling in new places. To be honest, when I read those quotes, I'm kind of bored. Like I've seen that story a million times before, right? This is a very, very standard oil and gas to geothermal story. No offense to Newsweek. I have seen those quotes from lots and lots of people. I have said versions of this many times before. So it really startled me when I came across this article from the California groups to recognize that those types of quotes that to me, to probably most of the people on this call are very standard, actually play really poorly with some audiences. I just had not fully understood that. And before you say, well, that's just Democrats, like, of course, California environmental groups hate oil and gas. It's not just among Democrats. We did our net trust graphic and testing by partisanship as well. And what you can see is there are big differences in partisan views on some of the people on this list, right? Environmental organizations, journalists, big partisan differences. But for oil and gas companies, there is a lot more consensus, right? Even among Trump voters, we are still at negative 24 net trust score for oil and gas companies. And we saw this throughout the survey and other questions as well. This is a pretty consistent finding that oil and gas companies are not trusted even by conservatives. And I think this really matters because trust is the most important factor, in my opinion, for public acceptance of projects. If people don't trust the operator running the project and they don't trust the government agency monitoring the project, they're not going to trust the project. And if they don't trust the project, they're not going to want the project be located in their community. And so this is one of the things that the geothermal community absolutely has to get right in order to enable widespread social license and deployment. And it's complicated, right? Because the oil and gas to geothermal story is a media hook that journalists love. I know that people like to talk about that story. And it's also a core part of the personal stories of a lot of people in the geothermal community. Maybe a lot of people listening to this presentation right now, folks who have a background in oil and gas and wanted to bring those skills to geothermal. That's central to the story of the geothermal community. So the question is, how can we tell that story in a way that doesn't accidentally trip people's wires on this very sensitive topic? And I think there is a way to tell that story that works. It just is going to require a little bit more thought. So that was what we wanted to look at, was actually how can we frame this story in a way that works for people? And so we had an A/B test. So again, very similar paragraphs with some differences highlighted in light blue. We had one version that focused more on the kind of overlap and connection between geothermal and oil and gas, and one that focused more on transitioning, right, from oil and gas to geothermal. And the overlap message mentioned specifically most next generation geothermal companies were founded by former oil and gas employees. And what we found when we tested it is that the transition message performed a lot better. And the overlap message, the message that mentioned that most companies were founded by former oil and gas employees, performed significantly worse. And this was actually, we did a lot of A/B tests for this research. This was the one that had the biggest difference between the two options. So I think that's really helpful and gives us a lot of clarity on how we can frame the oil and gas to geothermal story in a way that works. Reminder of, the message that performed best, right? Combining technologies in oil and gas with innovations in clean energy. Oil and gas workers can keep their jobs. Those things performed well. What performed poorly was the message that said most next generation geothermal companies were founded by former oil and gas employees. And basically, I think what's happening here is that people just don't trust oil and gas companies. And so connecting geothermal companies at the leadership or the C-suite level to oil and gas companies is going to bring that distrust right over to geothermal. And this is obviously not the case for everyone, right? I talked to a lot of Republican lawmakers and they really like that story, right? That story is something that they really respond positively to. But I think it's important for us to recognize that for the general public, even among Trump voters, there is a lot of mistrust of oil and gas companies, and we need to be a little bit more normal is starting at a trust deficit. There is a lack of trust in private companies. There is a lack of trust in oil and gas companies. And in order for geothermal to advance, we have to overcome that deficit. And this brings me back to what we looked at earlier with integrity-based trust and competence-based trust. Those two key types. Both of them are really important, but this research, Liu et al., found that integrity-based trust is actually more important. And integrity-based trust is basically, does the company care about safety? Is the company honest about the risks? Is the company open about the risks? And this came up really strongly in CATF's focus groups as well. People really wanted to know what is going on, be communicative, be open, like tell me what is happening, even about the concerns and the risks. And we have great examples of this in geothermal, like public seismicity monitoring that many projects have done. Forge has got computers in the libraries, right? So continuing and strengthening that type of public communication is a really important way to strengthen integrity-based trust. Another key piece is procedural justice. This is just a fancy way of saying that people need to feel that their input is taken seriously. There is a lot of research on this topic. Our focus groups showed this really strongly. I'm just showing a couple of highlights, but I want to focus on the McComas et al. Study, which is a study about induced seismicity. And what they found was in their experiment, they gave people different versions of information about a hypothetical case of induced seismicity. And people really, really don't like induced seismicity. Even if that induced seismicity does not cause any damage, even if it is associated with a project that benefits the community, even if it is induced seismicity that is the same amount as a natural seismicity in the same region, just the fact that the seismicity is induced, separate from any other details about it, is enough to make people feel really, really opposed and concerned. And across this research, the only piece of information that made people feel that seismicity was more acceptable was basically transparency and procedural justice. That research data is made public and that people like me have a voice in the decision to implement this technology. So ultimately, I think it's important for developers or other folks who are out in the community doing projects to, seek input from community members, co-create solutions, and work with the community. And then finally in this section, I'll just mention the importance of trusted external validators. This is not a replacement for direct engagement from project developers, but as a complement to that engagement, recognizing that private companies and geothermal companies might not be the most trusted, building relationships with other organizations and people who are trusted, who can share details about the project, about geothermal, and build that trust. And as a reminder, these are the kind of three groups or organizations or people that really rose to the top in CATF's research and in others' research. One, scientist. These have to be independent scientists, right? Not somebody who works for the company, but maybe a local university, staff member or professor, something along those lines, who can really speak about these topics. Residents near other plants who can talk about their experience of having a geothermal project, excuse me, and then community organizations. Our focus groups came really strongly with this recommendation, wanting these independent, neutral organizations to share information. So I next want to talk about some general best practices and then kind of putting it all together and what this actually looks like in the real world. So this slide is drawing on work from a great nonprofit called Greenlight America, and they really emphasize when talking to communities about projects, the importance of focusing on tangible benefits, local benefits, not just tax revenue, but something more specific. What does that tax revenue get you? So maybe the tax revenue from this project will be enough money to buy a new fire truck, something that really illustrates to people those benefits. And Greenlight America has also really highlighted the importance of being positive. Now, obviously, we want to give people information about the risks and answer questions and address concerns. That was what the last, 15 slides have all been about. And so it's important to do that using a sandwich approach where we're also being positive. So, starting with a true positive statement, the message that we want people to take away, then giving this factual response, addressing their concern, responding, and then finally ending with a positive reminder of the positive impacts of the project. So, I'll give an example what this might look like in practice. Let's say you're talking to someone about a project, in a local community, and they say, "Will this project pollute my water?" The first step in the response is to give them the key message that we want them to take away. Geothermal energy is an extremely safe energy source. Not repeating their concern back to them, but giving them the key message that is positive that we want them to remember. Then wells are lined with casing to ensure no contact between the water in the pipes and the water in the ground, and bringing in that research findings from before about scientifically backed regulation and trusted validators, right? We are required to follow standards for well casing, which are set by leading independent scientists. That is something that can make people feel more comfortable. And then finally, ending with that reminder of the positive local community benefit that this project might bring to a local community. That's just one example. Obviously, people are going to have different questions, but hopefully that helps to kind of give a little bit of context of what it might look like to bring together some of these different recommendations in a real conversation that we might have with a community member. So with that said, I next want to talk about one of the pieces of this research that I was most excited about, which is, do you say fracking or do you not say fracking? This is sort of the perennial debate that we've all been arguing about for years. And, on the one hand, fracking is a loaded term. There's a lot of baggage associated with fracking as a term. On the other hand, if you use a different term and then people later find out that you're describing hydraulic fracturing, they may feel deceived and they may lose trust. And so those are both good arguments. And what I really wanted in this research was to actually try to get some data to help us answer this question. So this is what we asked people. We gave them a little explanation, right? Water is pumped underground. It causes cracks to form. This is similar to oil and gas fracking, but there are differences that make it less risky. We listed out, some terms that people use for this process. And then the question we asked was, if you were describing this process to a friend, what term would you use? Trying to kind of frame the question so that people can indicate the answer that makes the most sense to them. What feels accurate, what they can understand, what feels right. And what we found is, well, firstly, there's no magic term that is universally preferred. We had an exactly even split between fracking and hydraulic fracturing. So disappointing to not have a clearer answer. But after getting this data, we dug into some of the demographic differences that changed people's views. And there were two that came through really clearly that I want to highlight. The first is voters in the West. Western voters prefer fracking by a margin of 14 points over hydraulic fracturing. And that is one of the highest differences across all the different demographic categories for this question. So really, really clear preference there. And voters who started out the survey by saying that they had a high level of concern about seismicity also prefer the term fracking. So we don't know why people preferred that term. We didn't have space in the survey to really ask a lot more follow-up questions. But we did get really clear feedback that the people who live in the places in the Western US where geothermal is going to be deployed soonest, and the people who are the most worried about geothermal, seismicity, do prefer the term fracking. So I think the takeaway that I have from this is that that's the term that I'm going to be using. Recognizing how loaded that term is, I would never recommend just using the term fracking and not following up. I think it makes sense to use that term, but then to immediately explain to people the differences, give a sentence or two of context of the difference between what they might think about fracking and what geothermal fracking actually is like. And there's some really interesting research from authors Westlake et al. About this exact question. It's called perception spillover, when negative opinions about fracking from oil and gas reduce support for geothermal. And what they found is that this spillover, this negative spillover, happens the least in a condition where participants are given more information on fracking. When you give them 2 paragraphs that give them more detail, the least amount of spillover happens. So I think that really points to this concept of more information leading to more support, even, information about the risks. We should not be afraid to talk to people about the concerns that they have. That actually is going to increase their support for geothermal. And finally, then coming to the close here, I wanted to loop back to the question we asked at the very end of our surveys. At the beginning of the surveys, we asked people about their support for geothermal. We asked them the same questions at the end of the survey after they'd gotten all this information about the risks and the benefits, and we wanted to see how their opinion would change. And what we found is that in our first survey, we had a lot of the people in the unsure category made up their minds by the end. Some of those folks ended up being concerned. Some of them ended up being supportive. And we ultimately ended with more support and more opposition. Similarly, in our seismicity survey, we had kind of pretty stable or slightly increased support, and then increase as well in opposition. So I think these are ultimately good signs that, giving people more information about geothermal, again, does not cause a huge upswelling of opposition, but also that messaging is really important, right? That, there is information about geothermal that can reduce support. And so we should message as well as we can in ways that don't accidentally trigger concerns that people might have. And this is a long-term process, right? This shows how people changed or didn't change their minds from the start of our seismicity survey to the end. What you can see is that most people did not change their minds. Most people ended in the same place that they started. Or if they did change their minds, they changed just by a little bit, right? They just went up or down 1 or 2 ticks on the question. And so the takeaway here is that we should be realistic about messaging and framing taking a long time. It's not something that in one survey you're going to change a lot of people's minds. It's something we have to invest in over the long term. The good news is that even for the people in this survey who said that they were concerned, somewhat or very concerned at the end of the survey, we asked them a follow-up question saying, okay, you're concerned. Which of these 2 options best represents your view, right? That either all energy sources have trade-offs, it might still be worth investing in geothermal, or nope, the risks are too great, don't support it. And what we found is that almost 40% of people were still open to geothermal. Even though they had concerns about seismicity, they were still open to the possibility of, changing their mind or of still supporting geothermal. And I think that really indicates the importance of what I call reluctant acceptance. Realistically, we're not going to get every single person in the US to be a full-throated supporter of next generation geothermal. It's just not possible. But the good news is that we don't need every single person in the US to be a full-throated supporter. What we need is enough support for projects to get sited in new places. And at that point, it is up to the project operators and developers to do a good job and to build trust among the community. Some people, some members of the public, will not be fully convinced just based on messaging alone. They need to actually see the project, working in their community over time. And the role of messaging is not to fix that or change that. That's a valid perspective for people to have. The role of messaging is to support the initial engagement and ensure that there is enough support to get the project sited. And then at that point, it will be up to the developer. And so, having thrown a lot of information at you, what I want to do here is just kind of give the key takeaways, right? So that if you only remember one slide from this whole presentation, this is the slide. Right now is our best chance to influence public perceptions of geothermal, and we cannot hide the risks. There is no world in which people don't learn about the risks. The question is, do we want them to learn about the risks from us or from someone else? And in my opinion, it is much better for them to get accurate information from folks in the geothermal community rather than to be, stumbling along with inaccurate information or coming up with analogies that don't quite work. And if we give them more information, there's a lot of research that actually that information can reduce their concerns. We want to focus on the positive to start and end and things like that. But overall, more information can really help. Finally, the most important thing is trust. And that is where everything comes back. Geothermal is starting at a deficit that we need to make up for in terms of trust. And the way we do that is through competence-based trust, emphasizing evidence-backed safety regulations as the most important communication technique and thing to say to people. Integrity-based trust, focusing on technology and workforce transfer from oil and gas, but de-emphasizing leadership or C-suite level connections to oil and gas companies. And finally, external validators, drawing on independent scientists and people who live near geothermal plants. And if we do all of this, the chances are high that we will build enough support to get projects deployed and support the growth of geothermal energy. The last slide I want to close this out on, we wanted this research to be useful, to inspire action. So in the spirit of that, I'm going to share what's next for CATF. We want to provide more information to people. We want to share some of this kind of not 101, but more 201 content, focusing on subsurface knowledge, emphasizing scientifically backed safety protocols, advocating for regulatory structures that will help people feel more comfortable, and also lifting up community voices from people who live near geothermal projects. We have 2 videos, you can scan the QR codes to see them, that highlight the positive impacts of geothermal on local communities, and we're going to share those far and wide. I encourage all of you to think about what you might do differently based on the findings and the research here. And I would love to stay in touch and hear what you are thinking. My email is here on the slide. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to have more conversations about the findings from this research and how we can communicate with the public in ways that are accurate and also build support for geothermal energy. So thank you so much, and I will stop my sharing and turn it back to Brian.
Thanks, Anne. Great presentation. Really, really. We've talked about this before, but I'm a bit of a nerd for social sciences stuff. So, fantastic presentation. Loved it. Everyone, we're going to have a Q&A session now, and I see there's already a couple of questions in there. I'm going to actually start with one of my own, though. Was there anything in your results that just jumped out as startling or surprising in this?
2 things. One is the lack of trust among even Trump voters for oil and gas companies. Like congressional Republicans, that's not the case. So it was surprising to me to see such a big difference between like Republican policymakers and like your average Republican voter. That really stood out. And then the other thing that really startled me was how much people are relying on analogies about the subsurface that are like wrong or confusing, right? That people just think like, oh, maybe there's a volcano down there. Oh, maybe there's a giant fault. I'm like, no, 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 no. Like we would know if there was a volcano or a giant fault, and people just really don't understand that. So I had heard that anecdotally, but seeing it so clearly in the quantitative data was really, really stood out to me.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. One other question from me here. Is there any follow-up research planned? You gonna dig deeper into this? What's the future plans with that?
Yeah, we would really like to look at these similar questions in Europe. This research was just focused on US voters, but there's obviously a lot of geothermal potential in other places in the world. There's a lot happening in Europe, of course, like Ever just announced their, success in Germany. So the hope is that we'll be able to do like a second phase of this research that is kind of doing the same or similar questions, but focusing in Europe potentially later this year, but depends on bandwidth and funding and all sorts of factors.
Great, great. All right, we'll go to audience questions here. And Kathy says, great presentation. Did the survey measure the level of knowledge of respondents had about geothermal? Is there any interesting association with this variable and the rest of the results?
Such a great question. We, in our original survey back in 2023, we did ask people about their level of knowledge of geothermal. And what was pretty funny was that a lot of them said they didn't know. And then some of them said they did know. And when we asked them questions that were like to kind of test their knowledge, they did not answer the questions correctly. So what I found funny was that people are kind of overstating, right, their level of knowledge of geothermal. In this survey, we were just surveying the general public. We were not trying to get to expertise. And so we did not ask. In our focus groups, we did ask. And in the focus groups, it was the same. People were like, oh, I've heard of that. Or, oh, I went to, Yellowstone one time or something like that, but there was a really low level. So we didn't want to spend one of our questions on it in the quantitative survey. We wanted to focus on things that we were more curious about.
Sounds good. And let's see, we have another question here. Colleagues in ESRI and Ireland have published research in minerals area, but similar idea, which shows that just by asking people to make a statement either way at the beginning of a survey or interview, this actually embeds an opinion. And therefore, the before-after changes are not a real reflection of a person reading or hearing uh, an opinion, but interesting work. I'm not sure if there's a question in there actually, but do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Survey design is so thorny. So I think that's a great flag. What was important for us was to understand how people actually make come to conclusions about geothermal in the real world setting. In a real world context where somebody's reading an article about geothermal, they're talking to their neighbor whose cousin lives in a town that's next to the town where a project is being cited, right? And our sort of approach was we're not trying to get the exact perfect conditions where there's no bias by any of these things. That's the opposite of what we want. We want to understand how can the geothermal community be messaging in a context where people are biased, where people are getting all of this other information, right? And so that's the way that this research kind of differs from some more academic research that is focused more on like exact replicable experimental conditions. We really wanted this to be a little bit more practical. And so I take the point in this question and I agree. And that was kind of to some extent intentional in the hopes of replicating the ways that people in the real world might actually encounter information about geothermal energy because as much as we wish it were the case, we don't get to sit them all down and spend 10 minutes walking through the exact information that they most need to know. So, how can we still be messaging in a way that works in those real world conditions?
Right. Good answer. Um, and we have another amazing presentation. Will the slides be shared?
That is a great question. I mean the whole thing is going to be recorded and put on YouTube, I believe.
Yes. Yes.
So I think that will have all of the slides, but we can probably also circulate a copy of the slide deck as well if that's something that people are interested in.
Sure. Great. And yes, the video
Just
will be
email me. My email is on the agarth@catf.us, so I'm happy to share.
fantastic. And I will and the YouTube video will possibly be up by the end of the day today, definitely be up by early next week on our YouTube channel. And we have another one from Kathy. We talk about oil and gas analogies, but is mining where there is also drilling? Does that come into the conversation, like underground mining?
Yes, such a great question. So, there's some really interesting research Dr. Catherine Lambert has done with co-authors in the UK that talks about perceptions of mining in Cornwall and how that affects perceptions of geothermal. Super fascinating. So, definitely something to look into. I would say the perceptions of the subsurface kind of riskiness, and that is that same person, Dr. Lambert and her co-authors mining is definitely a part of that. It's not just oil and gas. Like the what's going on down there associations come from mining, as well as from, all these other weird sources like, videos and movies. For geothermal, I think in terms of the trust, oil and gas companies are so much more visible and prominent that we chose to focus our questions around trust more on the oil and gas side and less on the mining side. But I also think that could be really interesting to explore in future additional research, like to dive into that a little bit more.
Right. That looks like all of the questions for, oh, no, we just got one more as I was about to wrap that up. Kenneth Vigby says, great presentation, Ann. I brought this up at GRC last year, but I'm interested in the most trustworthy way to reach audiences with clarifying information besides in-person messaging. In-person should be the best way to build trust, but I'm interested in how video, social media, or other ways to deliver messaging impacts trust, and if those methods of delivery are worth any time.
Such a great question. Unfortunately, we were not able in this research to like get super deep into this, but I would say just having spent a lot of time thinking about this, my sort of anecdotal, recommendation or thought would be that ultimately we have to be communicating through video, social media, and also things like interviews, right? Like going back to that example of the Newsweek article that was cited by these California groups opposing geothermal. Obviously, the person writing the article gets to decide how that article is framed. But the geothermal community chooses how we, give quotes to reviewers or what we say to reviewers, or sorry, to reporters. So especially because we can't show up at every single person's house in America and be like, here, I'm here to tell you about geothermal. It's really important to give that type of information. And, the survey that we did was not in person, right? It was questions in an online form. And we have evidence that those online messages do actually affect people's views. Like they change their mind, some of them by the end of the survey. So I definitely think it is important to consider how we can do that effectively. I would love in a world in which there's more research on this for people to really dive into like what's the best way to do that through videos or through graphics. That's not something that I have expertise in, but I think it's a super, super important question.
Great. And Carlos Guerres says, congratulations, this is great work, and has a quick question. Did you notice any meaningful differences in support across demographics in generally?
So the places where there was big differences, I pretty much highlighted those in the results. Age or education or region tended to be not a super big difference. Partisanship for some of them was a really big one. I didn't talk about benefits. We did ask a question about like which benefits of geothermal are most exciting to you, and you will probably not be surprised to learn that there was a huge difference by partisanship in which benefits were compelling. Like Democrats really like that geothermal is renewable. Republicans don't care. They really like that geothermal is like a, domestically produced energy source. So there were definitely some differences on partisanship. For things like age, or, gender, race, it tended to be like not as big of a difference for most of the questions in the survey.
And then one last question from Michael Yancey. Have you done polling on public opinion about water impacts?
We did not do any detailed polling about water beyond what was in the survey. I mean, we did see groundwater contamination coming up as, the number one concern people have. A lot of people in the open-ended responses were kind of bringing up things that they'd heard about fracking, right? We didn't prompt that, but like they were saying, oh, I've heard or I've seen videos, right, of fracking causing water contamination. Like, is that going to happen for geothermal? So I think that's a big piece of it. The other thing I'll note, and this also gets to Carlos's question about differences, one of the other concerns that we gave people as an option was that geothermal might take a lot of water, right? It might, use up a lot of water. And that was one where there was a big regional difference. Folks in the West, understandably, are a lot more concerned about that. And that was like number two for them. And it was pretty high on the list for everyone, but especially for voters in the West. So this is definitely an area with a lot of sensitivity around it. And I think we really saw that, coming through really clearly in this survey for sure.
That looks like does it for our questions. I do have one more for you though. So you kind of touched on this a little bit on your last slide, but I'm going to ask you to narrow it down even further and say, what is the biggest takeaway that you would like people to walk away with?
The most important thing for deployment is social license, and that requires trust. So everything that the geothermal community does, and when we advocate for policy, when we talk to people, all of it needs to be through the lens of how do we build trust in the developers, in the technology, and in the projects themselves.
Fantastic. Well, and we're just about to the top of the hour. So thank you so much, Anne, for leading us on this great discussion. And thank everyone for attending. And I hope to see you all soon.